They're always there, waiting for orders, ready to respond at a moment's notice. Their long history has forged versatility, loyalty, and ingenuity. The National Guard grew from the roots planted by the first English settlers in America into a unique and trusted part of the United States military forces. When the first English colonists arrived on the southeastern shores of North America, they encountered a mixed response from the indigenous people. Often, the new treaties they made disrupted previous alliances, and conflicts erupted. The genesis of the South Carolina Army National Guard began as the English settlers arrived in the Charlestown colony in 1670. In fact, the Royal Constitution decreed that all males between the ages of 17 and 60 were to serve in the colonial militia. Over the next 2.5 centuries, organized groups of soldiers served their communities through many disasters and conflicts. In order to strategize their defensive plans, militia members gathered in any available local houses or public buildings they could find. Finally, the need for a dedicated armory building for the specific use of the South Carolina militia was recognized by the federal government. The Militia Act of 1903 formally acknowledged and funded armories to house National Guard troops, their munitions, and to provide a permanent location for training. The earliest structures were built with fortress-like parapets to demonstrate a strength reminiscent of old European castles. Later plans provided by the Corps of Engineers produced many more much-needed structures. In 1952, blueprints for the Type B Cold War armories, with large open areas to accommodate these requirements, were prepared. The South Carolina Army National Guard went to work using these new plans. Relying on their successful experience with well-respected Columbia architect Hayward S. Singley, they collaborated on an armory designed to unify the many local units scattered across the state. However, Singley had a bigger idea. He wanted to find some physical element that reflected the selfless dedication demonstrated throughout the Guard's history. He envisioned an archetypal symbol to boldly illustrate the interconnectedness between all the men and women serving in the South Carolina Army National Guard. To accomplish his ambitious perspective, just one artist came to mind. A sculptor from Charleston stood out in Singley's unfolding vision: Willard Hirsch. Hirsch's story-based sculptures, fashioned in both stone and metal, impressed Singley. Hirsch was a Charleston native born in 1905, who returned to his hometown after nearly 2 decades of artistic training in New York City. He had honed his skills in sculptural decoration while studying at the National Academy of Design and Beaux-Arts Institute in New York. Like so many others, Hirsch's life was changed by World War II. To his astonishment, he was assigned to serve back in his home state at Fort Jackson. Hirsch settled back into Charleston life after the war. He opened a studio on Queen Street and committed himself to blending his personal artistic style with the culture of his home state. By the late 1940s, Willard Hirsch was becoming a distinguished artisan whose creations decorated many public spaces around the state. In a speech delivered to an audience at the Citadel in 1945, Hirsch declared that, "Art is a language, and a powerful one. All of us should know at least a few words of it." Singley no doubt had seen the busts Hirsch sculpted of some of the officers when he was stationed at Fort Jackson. The architect soon contacted Hirsch to discuss his ideas for the armory, detailing his hope for a single compelling visual element at each of the 40 or more new armories. Hirsch was definitely interested. Memories of New York flooded back. He was reminded of the huge graphic figures adorning the buildings in New York. Art Deco architecture and design is a style that originated in France around 1925. Its bold geometric forms mesmerized Hirsch. When this style was applied to the more flattened form of sculpture known as bas-relief, molded figures were able to maintain their natural contours. Despite the technical specifications of the project, Hirsch conducted his own deep research into the complex history of the South Carolina National Guard. Ultimately, a 4 by 7 foot bas-relief panel was unveiled, showing 9 unique soldiers symbolizing each campaign in their history. The men are seen on the lower half of the panel, marching together in 3 rows. They appear to be passing in front of an American eagle displaying a shield, with a carving of a Carolina palmetto tree growing out of a felled trunk. Each stylized soldier carries a weapon representative of the era over his right shoulder and appears to march in a timeless lockstep with his compatriots. Each individual uniform, including the headgear, was crafted by Hirsch to artistically reflect the period of the military campaign. Beginning on the far left of the frieze is a militiaman depicting the first European settlers in South Carolina. The bearded colonist, who is wearing a fringed buckskin shirt and what appears to be an animal fur cap, represents the Indian Wars from 1715 through 1763. Directly across from him, on the upper right side of the panel, is a Revolutionary soldier. With his hair tied back in the traditional fashion of the late 1770s beneath a tricorn hat, he points his bayoneted long rifle ahead of him toward his unseen battlefield. Back to the left again, below the Indian War Guard, a dragoon representing the War of 1812 is partially hidden. His remarkably tall stovepipe shako hat and chin strap are in view, as well as one of his epaulets. Marching just in front of him is a much more plainly attired fighter from the Mexican War of 1846. He wears a simple forage cap and wool, high-collared shirt, although his eyes are obscured by the weapon of the soldier in the first row. His flintlock musket rests heavily over his shoulder. To the right side of the palmetto tree and the eagle's shield, a Confederate soldier from the American Civil War stares straight ahead under the flat brim of his kepi cap. The soldier to the far right appears to be purposefully leading the entire group toward some ultimate battlefield the viewer cannot see. He is representing a group known as the Rough Riders, made famous by Teddy Roosevelt during the Spanish-American War of 1898. Shown on the first row at the bottom left is a member of the South Carolina Army National Guard who joined thousands more to provide support for the Mexican border campaign of 1916. The World War I doughboy is featured in the center of the front row. His slightly flattened British steel helmet is held firmly in place by the tight chin strap. Resting on what would have been a khaki-colored tunic is his American-made infantry rifle. Finally, the figure on the farthest right-hand side of the front row is a World War II soldier. Hirsch depicts him with a strong jaw and a slightly more determined appearance than that of the others. His M1 steel helmet obscures his eyes, highlighting the more defensive design when compared with the World War I version. A reverse impression called a mold was made from the original plaster prototype into which dozens of panels were poured. Each completed identical panel was then installed near the entrance of the more than 40 new armories built over the next decade. The armories, together with their unique shared icon, became beloved landmarks in the small towns where they stood. They also stand in unison with other public spaces featuring the art of Willard Hirsch. His sculptures and reliefs can be seen today at Charlestown Landing, Washington Square Park, White Point Gardens in Charleston, Brookgreen Gardens in Murrells Inlet, South Carolina, and a dozen other places. Most of the Type B Cold War armories are still used by the South Carolina Army National Guard. Several, however, are host to small-town events such as meetings, social gatherings, and dances. They are a monument to an era when 2 men collaborated with the 20th century National Guard to tell a story that was unknown to so many. The result is history, chronicled on a panel that honors dedicated people who have served as protectors of their communities for more than 3 centuries.